was not at all supporting that somehow communion, taking the bread and the cup, is somehow the way to salvation. The emphasis in that passage was very much that the way to salvation is belief in Jesus, and that the bread and the blood were used as spiritual metaphors. And that the tie there had less to do with the communion and rather had more to do with Jewish traditions, going back to where Ezekiel was told to take the words of God, to eat them, to make them part of himself, and then to proclaim them. And there's a Jewish tradition at the time that would have been that manna, when the Israelites were eating manna, that was like the Israelites eating and consuming and ingesting the Torah, God's laws and God's wisdom, and making it part of themselves. So the audience he was talking to, the metaphor and the imagery that they should have picked up on was more of this matter of taking what Jesus was offering, believing it, and making it part of him so that they would abide in him as having him as part of their life. At that point, references to the Last Supper would not have really made sense to that audience because it hadn't happened yet. And certainly at the Last Supper, where Jesus uses the metaphor of the bread and the cup in instituting communion, has references and ties back to that. But that passage wasn't supporting that as being a foreshadowing of communion as somehow being part of salvation. It was much more the Jewish tradition in that, and the tradition of Passover, since at that time, when he said, I am the bread of life, it was Passover time. And so in the minds of the Jewish people would have been the killing of the lamb, the eating of the lamb and the bread, the painting of the blood on the door as a reminder of God's salvation to the Israelites through the hands of Moses, leading them out of Egypt. And so at that time, we saw that many of the disciples who were following him in Galilee at that point, because they'd eaten the bread, the feeding of the 5,000, they had, in terms of Passover time, nationalistic thoughts in their mindset, because the Passover had become at that time not just a remembrance of Moses, God using Moses to remove the Israelites, to establish them as a nation in Israel, but rather also aspirations that the Messiah would come and throw off Roman oppression. So they see Jesus is doing these miracles, he feeds them, and they want him to become their king to throw off the Roman rule. And he separates himself from them because his time to be the king has not come yet. And because of this, you have many of the disciples at that time turn away from him because they find the sayings in his words that he is the bread of life as being offensive and hard, and they can't believe it and they can't accept it, and so they reject it. And by rejecting Jesus, they're also rejecting God. And the I'm the bread of the life discourse that we looked at last time ended with Jesus talking to his disciples and asking them, the 12 disciples, are you going to leave me also? And Simon Peter responding, no, of course not. You have the words of life. Where else are we going to go, basically? And recognizing true faith in Jesus' words rather than in following his miracles as something that he's doing for them. And that's kind of the context where we come to chapter 7. We'll start with the first two verses, and then we'll talk about some background of the tabernacle feast and where we are geographically. So in John chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. So after these things is an indication of chronology as far as after the events of the feeding of the 5,000, the I am the bread of life, but it's not indicating that it was immediately, the day after, the week after, etc. It's very likely 6 months later, because that would have been the approximate time period between the Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles. And based on verse 2, it's very clearly this is the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And at this time, Jesus is still in Galilee. He's been in Galilee for the past 6 months. The accounts of what he was doing is not recorded in the Gospel of John. Mark, Matthew, and Luke spend more time talking about the ministry of Jesus in Galilee than John does. And the reason he's there and isn't going to Judea is because after he healed the lame man at this pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath and proclaimed his defense for doing that to the Pharisees, who were like, you can't work on the Sabbath. This is not to be done. This is you're evil for doing this. And he proclaims basically that no, it's not, because even they recognize that God doesn't stop his work on the Sabbath, and he, being one with God, is doing God's work on the Sabbath, which of course then wants to make them kill him for blasphemy because they don't accept him as being the Son of God. And so because of that, they're on their watch that the next time he comes to Judea, they may possibly try to kill him. So he's ministering in Galilee, because his hour has not come yet. Even though he's been sent, and the will of the Father is that he goes to Jerusalem and be killed as a sacrifice for his sins, his hour hasn't come yet. It's not the right time yet. So he is in Galilee at this point. So let's talk a little bit about the Feast of Tabernacles before getting more into the details of this passage. So the Feast of the Tabernacles would have been one of the 3 major pilgrimage feasts of the Jewish traditions. So with all 3 of these, and that would be Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. And with these 3, it was pretty much expected that all Jewish males would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate these 3 events. And these 3 events both mark and commemorate things that God had done for the Israelites, but each one of them was also looking forward to the promise of something God was going to do in the future. And these were also tied very much to the agricultural calendar of the Jewish seasons. So in Israel, there's basically just 2 seasons, the rainy season and the dry season. The rainy season starts the end of October and would go through May-ish, and the dry season would start in May and go to October. The main growing season for crops like barley and wheat would be during the rainy season, and the main growing season for olives, grapes, figs, the fruit trees, and the fruit vines would be more the dry season. And so harvest of barley would start towards the end of the rainy season in March, and Passover would have landed at that time as being both a commemoration of God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt into the Promised Land, but also a festival of first fruits as they are starting their first harvest of the barley. And then 50 days later, as they're wrapping up the wheat harvest, which barley harvest would have been March, April-ish, and wheat harvest would have been April, May-ish. 50 days later, it would be the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, because it was 50 days, Penta, after the Passover event. And so those would have been 2, and both of those would have been pilgrimage feasts. Feast of Tabernacles would have been towards the end of October, And this would have been towards the end of the dry season. And this, of the three major pilgrimage feasts at that time, was the most popular and was kind of the biggest deal in terms of all of them. And that's not to take away from the importance of Passover. It's just the Feast of Tabernacles. You'd have Jewish men coming to Jerusalem from all over Israel, and even those who were dispersed among the Greeks would come. So at this time, one of the things about the Feast of Tabernacles is if you wanted to proclaim and set up a kingship over the Jews, that would be the time to do it, because that's when the most of them would be in Jerusalem. So along with Passover having these nationalistic thoughts, the Feast of the Tabernacles would also. In the Feast of the Tabernacles, they would build temporary structures out of sticks, etc., that they would live in during this time to commemorate, again, God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt through the wilderness to the Promised Land, where they were living in tents and temporary shelters, and they were being sustained by manna from heaven, and then in some cases the water that was brought from the rocks. And so there's a tie-in here thematically, even though there's 6 months between the feeding of the 5,000 and the Feast of Tabernacles. In the Gospel of John, these are put back to back because thematically, in the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the things they would be thinking about as a people would be God's provision as they were nomadic in the wilderness with bread from heaven, a tie back to Jesus' I am the bread of life, where the people were demanding a sign like manna that Moses had given. And Jesus was saying he was giving them something more than that. And then also, the Feast of Tabernacles has tied to it symbols of water, tying back to Jesus offering the Samaritans living water. And we'll see going forward, probably next week and the week afterwards, that water imagery shows up again in chapter 7 and chapter 8 as Jesus explains further to the people. And so with the Feast of the Tabernacles, they'd build these temporary shelters, but some other things that were going on. It was a 7-day feast, is that there would be a water ceremony. As part of the water ceremony, I'm going to come back to that. Part of the water ceremony, the priest would go from the temple to the pool of Siloam that is in the lower city of Jerusalem. They would get water from there, and they would take that water back to the temple, and with much celebration, they would then pour it on the altar. And this was a reminder of both the physical water that God provided for them as they traveled to the wilderness, and that he continues to provide through the rainy season, but also as a picture of God providing and pouring out the Spirit on them. In reference, there would be Isaiah 44:3, if you want to turn there. We're not going to be there long, but one of kind of the passages that they might meditate on in regards to this would be Isaiah 44:3. Where it says, "For I will pour water on him who is thirsty, and floods on the dry ground. I will pour my Spirit on your descendants, and my blessings on your offspring." So there's a tie between physical water and the living water of the Spirit. And that would be especially on the minds of the people. Water would be especially on the minds of the people at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, because this is towards the end of the dry season. Their water sources would have been partially based on rain throughout the growing season. It would be based on springs of water, living water, which were the most coveted, most prized water sources, would be springs or a dug well that was fed by a spring. And their other source of water that would sustain them throughout the dry period would they dig cisterns. And so that would be a dug that would have kind of a small opening and then widen out at the bottom. They'd try to dig it out in a rocky area and then plaster it so that during the rainy season that would start end of October, they would channel rain and store rain into there. And throughout the dry season, this would help sustain them. So by the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, those cisterns are getting really low. And any water that's left of them is not the bestest quality, because as the rain would wash water into there, sediment and debris would get in there. That sediment and debris would settle at the bottom, so that as they're drawing the water through the dry season, it's relatively clean water, not as good as the running living water. And as they're getting towards October, they're starting to hit that point in the cistern where they're starting to get into the muck that's on the bottom. So this is, a desert land where water is extremely precious. And here, so part of what they're celebrating at the Feast of Tabernacles is God bringing that rain that is going to be coming that they badly need to refill those cisterns. And so the image of water would be even more important to them than it would be to us. And so as part of the Feast of Tabernacles, they would celebrate that with the water ceremony, both looking at God providing their physical needs with water, but then also his spirit, and using water as an image for that. Along with that, the other tradition that would be done at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles is in the temple compound area during the 7 days, they would light large bonfires. And fire throughout the Old Testament be a symbol of God's presence. So you have Moses, God meeting Moses at the burning bush. You have, as Moses is leading the people through the wilderness, there's that pillar of fire that leads them, the presence of God, God's Shekinah glory that would settle over the tabernacle every time that they stopped. And so these bonfires in the temple area were this symbol from afar off that they were celebrating God's presence during this time period and his provision to them. And so kind of three things that occurred in the Feast of the Tabernacles. You'd have them building these temporary tabernacles. You'd have the water ceremonies and the fire. And you can kind of see that already these are some images that have been used in the Gospel of John for Jesus, starting in the introduction as far as Jesus being the light that comes to a dark world. We have the living water with the Samaritan woman. We even have in John 1:14, you don't need to turn there, but in John 1:14, we have, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." And that word "dwelt" there in Greek literally means to tent or tabernacle. So God was coming down and tenting and tabernacling in his temporary human form. It was very appropriate during the Feast of Tabernacles, where they were building these temporary tabernacles to remember God's provisions for them. Now, the sad thing with this is, through this, we're going to see that as they're focused on the Feast of Tabernacles, they're completely missing that the light of God, the living water of God, is tabernacling amongst them as Jesus Christ is there physically with them. So all of these symbols that we're supposed to be looking forward to the promise, they're so focused on the symbols that they're missing that he's there. And so that is the context of where we are with chapter 7. Let's see, going back a little bit, how Jesus got to Galilee was he needed to go through Samaria, and we saw that he traveled from Jerusalem through Samaria, stopping at the Jacob's well and having the conversation with the woman at the well. And we talked about at that time that the most direct route from Jerusalem to Cana or to Galilee would be directly through Samaria. But because of basically racism between the Samaritans and the rest of the Jews, this is somewhat fraught with peril on both sides. But what's interesting is evidently, for the most part, the Samaritans were okay with Jews traveling through Samaria as long as they were traveling north away from Jerusalem. If they were traveling away from Jerusalem, no problem. Now, from a hospitality standpoint, the tradition was, it was pretty much taboo for Samaritans to give something to the Jewish people, and for the Jewish people to give something to the Samaritans, but it was okay for them to exchange money for those things. And for the most part, the Samaritans were pretty tolerant with northward travel. On the other hand, southern travel, Jesus would have traveled, and Jews would typically travel the long route. They would head east of the Jordan if they're heading southern to skirt around Samaria to get to Judea and Jerusalem. Much longer route. The Samaritans did not look kindly on Jews traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem. In some cases, they would stop or dissuade them from traveling through and deny them. In other cases, Josephus even records that they would kill Jews who were traveling south to Jerusalem. Since part of the contention between the Jews and the Samaritans was where to worship, the Samaritans said, well, at Mount Gerizim, and the Jews said at Jerusalem. The Samaritans were okay if Jewish individuals were heading away from Jerusalem, but heading towards Jerusalem, that was not to be tolerated. They had to take the long route if they wanted to do that. All right, so as we get into chapter 7, we're going to deal pretty much with the first 13 verses today. We're going to kind of go through the details of them. This is an outline from Klink's commentary on John 1 to 2. It's a background. Jesus is in Galilee at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. He has not traveled there, which is somewhat remarkable because all Jewish males were expected to travel to Jerusalem during this feast time. Verses 3 to 5, we're going to see he's challenged, mocked, and to some extent ridiculed by his half-brothers, which kind of goes along with the end of chapter 6, where we see many of the individuals who had been following him and wanting him to become king and do miracles for them, they've abandoned him. And that doesn't just extend to the general people of Galilee, it extends to his brothers. In verses 6 to 9, Jesus has a response to his brothers. And then 10 to 13, we see a reluctance towards Jesus, both through those who are for and against him, because of the Jewish leadership. And then 14 to 52, that we'll get into next week, is kind of the core of the next of the 7 discourses, the 5th of the 7 discourses that Jesus has at the Feast of the Tabernacles. So let's take a look starting in a verse. Since we've done verses 1 and 2, let's start with verse 3. So his brothers therefore said to him, "Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." But we stop reading there, it seems very much that they're promoting his ministry. They're saying, you know what, Galilee is kind of this backwater. If you want to be on the main stage, if you want to have the biggest audience, if you want to have the biggest public splash, being in Jerusalem right now at the Feast of Tabernacles is the time to do it. Go there, put on a big display, do all your fancy big miracles and such, and proclaim yourself. But if we continue and read verse 5, for even his brothers did not believe him. That kind of footnote put in there shows that 3 and 4 are not his brothers enthusiastically wanting to spread the gospel and wanting to expand Jesus' ministry. It's more along the lines of, depart from here. Get out of here. Leave. Galilee's our place. You're causing trouble. Go to Jerusalem. They know full well he's been remaining and walking in Galilee because the Jewish leadership in Judea has their eyes out for him and wants to kill him. They're basically saying, hey, go to Jerusalem and you're not our problem anymore. You're not besmirching our family name. But they're doing it in a way that they're mocking and ridiculing him and basically saying, we see, you're in it for the attention and the glory. You're nobody special. You go do it and see how it works out on the big stage. Because they don't believe yet. Now, eventually they do come to believe, but not yet at this point. And kind of, not the main focus of this passage, but kind of a take-home application out of this is that being born of believers does not guarantee one's individual belief. An individual isn't born into salvation because of their parents. I mean, here are some individuals who, if they had parents who are believers, they're the sons of Mary. They're the sons of Mary and Joseph, two people who angels came to and said, you're going to be the parents, well, Mary is going to be the mother of the Messiah, and Joseph is going to be stepfather. They would have grown up in a household where Jesus was their older brother. You think about that. If there's a household where you'd think the entire family would believe in God and believe in Jesus, it would be, the one where he lived and grew up. But no. An individual's salvation is based on their belief, not their parents' belief. Now, certain parents can have an influence in teaching their children. And we saw that in our study of Judges, that the responsibility of one generation to teach the next generation. We also saw in Judges the responsibility of the next generation to accept and follow God on their own. And here we see an example of that where this next generation who grew up in the household with Jesus are not believers at this point. And not only that, they're mocking him and wanting him to head off. Now, part of this, we're not going to turn there, but at some point it's on the handout. Zechariah 14 may be a passage that some people at this time had in mind, because that's a passage where it mentions and ties the Messiah to the Feast of Tabernacles. And so because of that, there was a tradition in Jewish teaching at that time that the Messiah might possibly reveal himself and set himself up during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so one of the looking forward things of the Feast of Tabernacles was looking forward to the Messiah setting up his kingship. And so his brothers may be saying, look, you know what? If you want to fulfill Zechariah, now's the time to do it. Now, ironically, even though they're ridiculing and mocking him, they are correct. He is the Messiah. He is going to fulfill the passage in Zechariah. But Jesus' response goes on from that verse 6, and Jesus says to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And when he had said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. So his response to his brothers is, my time has not yet come. He's kind of acknowledging to them that, yeah, he is going to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah. But not yet. Not in their time frame. He isn't on earth at that time to fulfill the kingship of the Messiah. He has a different role, to be the Lamb of God who is sacrificed to take away the sin of the world. And throughout the Gospel of John, we have the hour. Back in the first miraculous sign at the wedding at Cana, he mentions, my hour is not yet. And his hour referring to when he'd be lifted up and exalted on the cross. And that in Greek is the word ora, or hora. Here, John uses the word kairos for time, and they're linked but different. Both of them are referring to a timeline that God has ordained and sent Jesus to fulfill. But here, the my time, he's not referring specifically to his death on the cross. He's referring more to the bigger timeline that God has for him in terms of when and if he will go to the Feast of Tabernacles. When he will become the Messianic king. And in the short term, he's telling them that he is not going to fulfill the request to go to this feast at this time to put on a big show. He's not saying he's not going to go to the Feast of the Tabernacles. In the New King James, it makes it a little bit more clear, and it says, I am not yet going up to this feast. Though a lot of translations, and probably truer to the original Greek, is he's saying, I am not going to this feast. And he's not saying here that he's not going to the feast at all. He's saying he is not going with them, and he is not going at their bidding. He is not going in response to their challenge and mockery. He is not going to do big signs. He is going in his Father's timeline to preach his word. He's also saying in here, the world cannot hate you. He's basically telling them the world can't hate them because they're of the world. They're just as evil and sinful as the world is. He is making a pretty strong indictment against them in saying that the world hates him because he testifies against the sin and evil of the world. He is the light that shines in darkness, whereas they, because they don't believe in him, are part of that darkness. He responds to their mockery with a very strong indictment, an indictment that only God can level against them. But being God, he has the authority to do that, even though they don't quite recognize that yet. And so he tells them, you go up to this feast. This being the feast that they are imagining in their heads, as opposed to the feast that he will go to, which is physically the same feast, but he has a different mission at that feast than they do. So there's kind of a play on words here in that it's physically the same Feast of Tabernacles they'll both attend, but the feast that they're attending has a different mission than the feast that he is hosting, essentially. And so he remains in Galilee. But when his brothers, moving on to verse 10, but when his brothers had gone up, and here looking at the map, we might think, go up. John has his directions all missed. Well, no, go up is correct. Galilee is a very low elevation, and Jerusalem is a very high elevation. So you're going up to Jerusalem. It's only kind of in the northeast that we talk about going north as going up and going south as going down. That's not really correct. So John has his geography correct here. They would go up to Jerusalem in two ways. One, it's a higher elevation. The villages around Capernaum where he had been ministering are below sea level, and Jerusalem is significantly above sea level. But then also, going up to Jerusalem is symbolic as far as approaching God in the temple. So one goes up to Jerusalem, both physically and spiritually, hopefully. But when his brothers had gone up, he also went to the feast. Not openly, but as if it were in secret. So he quietly, secretly goes because he is not at this time ready to reveal himself as a Messianic king. The time is wrong for that, even though that's what his brothers were goading him to do. And evidently it's not long before the Jews figure out that Jesus has arrived at the Feast of Tabernacles. Because in verse 11 we have, "Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, 'Where is he?' And in some English translations, it is, 'Where is that man?'" And this may be somewhat of a reference back to John chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. Another time when they were seeking him. In John chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, this is after he has healed the lame man in Jerusalem. And the Jews, being the Jewish leadership, are approaching the lame man who's carrying his mat on the Sabbath, and they're chiding him for doing work on the Sabbath. And his response is, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.' And then they asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Who is this evil influence who told you such heretical things to get up and walk on the Sabbath? Who would do such a thing of healing you on the Sabbath? Who would do such a thing of making someone whole on the Sabbath? Well, God would. But they kind of missed that because they were focused on the traditions. They were focused on, he's breaking the Pharisaic traditions, the rabbinic writings, the Mishnah, that at that point they held so sacred. In some cases, they held those in higher esteem than the Scripture. To contradict the Scripture was less of an offense to them than contradicting the Mishnah. And so the last time we see the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem hunting for him, they're referring to, who is this man who is doing these heretical things of healing and doing work on the Sabbath, and then on top of that, defending himself by claiming to be God himself. They're using the same terminology here. And we're going to see next week that Jesus recognizes this is on their mind because he brings back up the healing on the Sabbath. And so the Jews are seeking him, and in the Greek here, the Jews sought him. Very much the connotation is this is a hostile search. They are not looking for him out of curiosity at this point. They're not looking at him because they want to invite him to be the guest speaker at the Feast of Tabernacles. They have evil on their minds. And in verse 12, "And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, 'He is good.' Others said, 'No, on the contrary, he deceives the people.' However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews." And as a reminder, when in the Gospel of John, the Jews is used, depending on context, it can be all of the Jewish people. It can be just people from Judea. So when the Jews is in contrast to Galileans, it's usually the Judeans, because people in Galilee would be Jews also. And then also it's most often used as the Jewish leadership who have kind of set themselves up above everybody else, including above Jesus, God himself. And here it would be the latter. So the Jewish people who have come to Jerusalem are quietly amongst themselves debating and discussing Jesus, some thinking he's good, some thinking he's deceiving the people, but none of them feel free to speak openly. The Jewish leadership has so made it very clear that they are out to get Jesus, that even those who think he might be deceiving the people are afraid to say that. They think that's only something that the Jews are allowed to do, the ruling Jews are allowed to do. So at this point, the animosity has gotten so strong that even the people are afraid to discuss whether Jesus is good or bad. And this section here with verse 13 kind of ends where it started and that Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. In verse 13, it ends with the Jewish people being afraid to speak about Jesus because the Jews are out to kill Jesus and presumably come down on anybody who might have thoughts on him. And in between, we have Jesus responding and correcting his brother's misunderstanding, his brother's mockery, his brother's ridicule on this kind of small private scale. We're going to see this theme expands next week in verses 14 to 15 with the public rejection of Jesus. Jesus responds and corrects all of those in Jerusalem who are opposing him on a much larger public scale. So he doesn't do what his brothers want, leave Galilee and put on a public display of miracles and such to put himself as king, but rather he does publicly respond to the rejection that the people are having. And let's close there. And Jeff, could I get you to close in prayer?